In 1770, a Scottish explorer discovered the remnants of a large Jewish community in northern Ethiopia. At the time, the population was 100,000, but an estimated 500,000 had once lived there. These Jews of Ethiopia have been there for centuries. They called themselves Beta Israel, the House of Israel, and they followed the Torah. There was a long history of persecution and discrimination, but it got much worse when a coup toppled Haile Selassie's regime in 1973. Many Jews were killed, many more made homeless. In 1980, Ethiopia banned the practice of Judaism and teaching of Hebrew, and members of the faith were harassed and imprisoned. Subsequently, Israel officially applied the law of return to the Beta Israel community. In 1984, a covert mission dubbed Operation Moses airlifted 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel. About 2,000 more were brought to Israel in 1985 in a mission dubbed Operation Joshua, which brings us to the third and last official covert mission. That was called Operation Solomon. In just 36 hours, more than 14,000 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel on 35 flights. Operation Solomon occurred in May 1991. A much bigger challenge awaited these Ethiopian Jews when they arrived, assimilating them into the Israeli culture. That's where our interview subject and guest come in. First, however, some background. Cary Rosenthal and his wife Donna were among the earliest members of Temple Emanu-El. They've been active members for years, and Cary is a former temple president. He and Donna share a deep love for their Judaism and for Israel. Cary's commitment goes well beyond Temple Emanu-El to the greater Jewish community of Atlanta and into Israel itself. His resume of volunteer work is voluminous. It includes being appointed to the Israel and Overseas Allocation Committee, and then he was named chair of the Ethiopian Resettlement Subcommittee. And that is where Cary's participation in a major event in Israel's history occurs. Joining us is Temple Emanu-El Senior Rabbi Spike Anderson. Cary, this is a unique choice you made. What was your inspiration to work in the resettlement of the Ethiopian Jews to Israel?
Like so many things in life, Eric, I would characterize it perhaps as happenstance and a series of events that happened along the way that tied the whole thing together. The first of which happened to be in this building, Temple Emanu-El building. The board invited an Atlanta ophthalmologist to come and speak to the board about his exploits in Ethiopia. What he had been doing, self-funded, was traveling annually to Ethiopia and repairing the eyes of the Jews in the Gondar province, which is in northern Ethiopia, as you know. And I was absolutely taken aback by his presentation. That stimulated research on my part to learn more about the community, and I came across this book. I happened to bring it with me, called Surviving Salvation, and it was written by none other than Dr. Ruth Westheimer.
Which was a surprise to hear.
I happened to fall into a position later on where I co-chaired the Jewish Book Festival for the center, and she was the keynote speaker opening Saturday night, and as the chair I had the privilege of introducing her, which meant I had an hour or so with her in the green room prior to the event starting. And I'm sitting and chatting with her, and she said, she called me Mr. Bossman. She couldn't get my name straight. She's Mr. Bossman. Which of my books have you read? So I said, Surviving Salvation. Her mouth literally dropped, and she said, "You're the first person that ever said that. How did you come across that book?" And actually, before she wrote the books on sexology, she wrote a book on, co-authored a book on Ethiopian Jews. This was her very first book years before. Coming back to the evolution of my involvement, this happened almost at the same time that I was asked to serve on the board of Federation. And the executive director at the time, David Sarnat, asked me what area of Federation would I like to focus on. which committee? And I immediately responded, Israel, and they had an Israel Overseas Allocations Committee, which was a major part of Federation. Federation at that time was generating about $10 million a year in annual giving, and approximately 50% was what we call the Israel split. In those years, virtually all of it went to the Jewish Agency. We had, as a committee, we had a little bit of input as to whether we wanted the money directed in Israel, but basically it was up to them. David happened to have a friend who ran the San Francisco Federation who was doing direct service projects in Israel. They talked about it, and he came to the board, and the board voted to allow us on the Israel Overseas Committee to devote 10% of our $500,000 budget to direct service projects, and which was $500,000 a year. And we asked various agencies in Israel to bring presentations to us for what their needs were, and then we'd vote on the ones that we set the priorities insofar as how to allocate the money. One of those presenters happened to be a gentleman by the name of Dr. Cary, who ran Emanu-El, which was a youth aliyah village in Israel. Youth aliyah villages were basically schools that were set up, high schools, for wayward kids that were having parental problems, drug problems, so on and so forth. And this one was a very prominent one, happened to be located just south of Haifa. And Dr. Cary, as an educator and sociologist, took an interest in the Ethiopian community. This tied in to Operation Solomon, which was the second wave, perhaps was a smaller wave in between Operation Moses, which was the first, but the major one was Operation Solomon, during which tens of thousands of Ethiopians were brought into Israel. It also coincided with the Russian immigration. Almost at the same time, Israel was bringing in over 1 million Russians and tens of thousands of Ethiopians all at one time. So housing became a major issue, and what the Israeli government decided to do at the time was the fastest housing that they could come up with was setting up caravan sites, what we in America call trailer parks. And as a matter of fact, we tied up the manufacturing in America for trailers that were being made as quickly as we could and shipped over to Israel. And they had other sources to get trailers as well. One such trailer park was set up on the road to Haifa called Neve Carmel, and it was near Emanu-El. So the government of Israel began housing Ethiopians and Russians together in this trailer park or this caravan site.
How'd that work out?
I'm about to say, that sounds like a recipe for disaster to me.
Well, I'll come to that in a little bit because it became a major problem. The Russians weren't very accepting of these black Africans. The Israelis were somewhat more accepting. The Russians literally hated the blacks. It was as bad as I've read about the early South in America. I mean, it was just as bad. But be that as it may, within the Ethiopian community, they were having problems. It was a patrilineal society, and in Ethiopia, traditionally, the men would retire at about age 40, and the family would take care of them. Well, in Israel, at 40, you're in your prime, and the Ethiopian men coming over to Israel didn't want to work. That was their mindset. That was their tradition. And their children were losing respect for their own fathers, and there were a lot of fighting going on, so on and so forth. So a number of them were sent to youth aliyah villages. The more prominent one that was housing Ethiopians happened to be Emanu-El because of Dr. Cary's interest, so on and so forth. And he happened to be tied into Federation with his presentation for us doing direct funding to help him, not only with the Ethiopians, to help fund programs at Emanu-El.
These Ethiopians were rural in nature. That was the way they lived back in Ethiopia. That's what they knew.
When you say rural, it was really primitive. No running water, no electric. They literally lived in huts. As a matter of fact, each family had 2 huts. The family hut, and they had a small hut for the women who during their period would have to move out of the family hut and for the 7 or 8 days, whatever it was, live in the small hut. They were an agrarian society. It was farming and very, very primitive.
It sounded also like that they were a type of Orthodox Jewish cult.
Oh, of course, Rabbi Spike can address that certainly better than I can, but my knowledge, what I was told, is they practice what we might call pre-Talmudic Judaism.
Correct.
And it was very, very strict, but again, it was pre-Talmudic. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, a lot of our modern Jewish practice is based on halakha, and that halakha, that law, is based on rabbinic Talmudic law. So if you have a Jewish society that predates and separated from the overall Jewish community before Talmudic law came into play, at least in a predominant way, then they have practices that are more what we would call biblical, as opposed to Talmudic. I'll give you a for instance. So the laws of kosher, kashrut. So there's a pasuk, there's a line from the Torah that says that we're not allowed to stew a kid, a baby goat, in its mother's milk.
Right.
Well, the rabbinic Talmudic tradition that comes out of that is no meat and milk of any type mixed together on the same plate, and the hour, 4 hours, 6 hours difference between the two. The simple interpretation, which is the biblical one, is, okay, don't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. So the Ethiopian Jews, the Bnei Yisrael, that's how they interpreted that. You can't cook a baby goat in its mother goat's milk, because that's the literal translation of it, without the rabbinic exposition that comes from that afterwards. And there's lots of examples of that. There was pre-Talmud, there was actually a competition for sort of what was the mainstream Judaism at one time. There was a group called the Carites, and the Carites rejected they predated and then rejected in turn the rabbinic explanation of how Judaism was supposed to flow. And for a while, they were sort of head-to-head. What was going to emerge as the dominant Judaism, the Carites, or what we know now as Talmudic Judaism, and things like, are you allowed to kindle a fire on Shabbat or not, okay, or even have a fire? So the Carites would say, it says no fire, you've got to sit in the dark on Shabbat. And the rabbis from the Talmud say, no, as long as you light it before, you're okay, you can have the fire, that type of thing. So we all know how this wound up, because there are no Carites left, or at least in any sort of mainstream form.
Where did they originate, the Carites? Do you know?
Same area, same Jerusalem and surrounding areas. So to the point, the Ethiopians had a pre-Talmud understanding of Judaism, which was a much more biblical and literal interpretation of it. And there's some other differences with calendar and holidays and that type of thing, but that's the gist of it.
Okay. So, Cary, you have a very paternalistic, primitive people coming
Correct.
to Israel.
Correct.
And so there's pushback. Even the children are pushing back on fathers now.
Mostly the sons.
Yeah.
The daughters as well, but mostly the sons.
And education, inserting education into this community, what was that like?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There were language issues. They spoke Amharic. They did not speak Hebrew. Their Kas rabbis certainly did. But Amharic was the native language, so they had a very, very difficult time learning language skills. They were better with math and science. They could teach them math and science more easily than they did language skills. So that was an obstacle that they had in learning. Coming back to the religious aspect, I think it's important to note also that the authenticity of their Judaism was questioned by the religious authorities in Israel. It wasn't a slam dunk. Their rabbis, a Qasim, weren't permitted to participate in bat din, perform other rituals, rabbinic rituals, so on and so forth. It took a long time, and there were arguments within the religious authorities. The Sephardic and the Ashkenazi head rabbis didn't agree, so on and so forth. Today, of course, we're beyond that. But the period that we're talking about, in the early 1990s, it was a very, very difficult position for the religious leadership of the Ethiopian community.
And the Israeli religious leadership, I guess.
Insofar as what?
Insofar as they feel a conflict with the way the Ethiopian Jews
Practice
religion.
So in the 70s, the Rabbinic Authority of Israel came to the conclusion, with some significant debate, that the overall that they were Jews, that the Bnei Israel were Jews, but had strayed far enough away, and there was enough question that when they came to Israel in the various waves, they were required to do a modified conversion ritual, including mikvah, a general beit din for everybody, meaning they wouldn't come in one at a time, and for the men, a ritual circumcision, which checked the boxes that the rabbinic authority, both Sephardim and Ashkenazi, needed in Israel, but was hugely problematic and embarrassing to the Ethiopian Jews, who had literally for 100 generations had stuck to this Jewish identity, and what their origins are we can talk about later in the conversation, but stuck with this Jewish identity on pain of persecution and even death, now coming to Israel and being told, you're Jews, but we're not quite sure, and so we're just going to make sure by making you go over these rituals. Now, as in the 30 years since that's all happened, and there's still Aliyot movements coming in, the traditional Ethiopian Judaism has really fallen to the wayside, and they have gone towards, for the most part, what we would call orthodoxy, and by that I mean Ashkenazi normative orthodoxy in terms of their practice. So there's not a lot of difference now, but certainly it was a point of real contention. If you can imagine, let's imagine American Jews going over to Israel and being told, you're not really Jewish, you've got to be recircumcised and go through a conversion process.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be too happy about that.
On the education issue, it was mainly for boys, getting them educated in Israel, but the men didn't want to participate.
That's what I was alluding to earlier. As far as they were concerned, they wanted to be served by their family, which was the tradition in Ethiopia. When you hit that age, approximately 40 years old, the family took care of them. And of course, I don't know exactly what the lifespan was in Ethiopia, but in most cases, I would assume that there was a grandfather involved in the family as well. If you retire at 40, you have to assume that there were a bunch of 60-year-olds that weren't working. So you had a whole cadre of people in Ethiopia that weren't part of the workforce, weren't out in the fields farming and producing for the family. They were being taken care of, and they expected that in Israel. It was a major problem. It took quite a while for them to adjust their mindset and become part of the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as a people as a whole, they didn't have what we would know as Western education, no formal. Many of them came over illiterate. And so if you're coming from a different country, but you're educated and you have to sort of now learn Hebrew, and it's another flavor of the same thing. But for many of them, there was a really steep learning curve with a lot of growing pains to even get them into the system. But the Israeli government seemed to do a pretty good job of, at least for the youngest generation, pushing them into the Western education and getting them to higher education quickly When I was 19, I was at Hebrew University in Jerusalem for a semester abroad, and this is 1993, and in that year, as I understand it, the first 3 Ethiopian Jews were entered to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the first 3 in 1993, and they were being pushed really hard because we needed to start the flow of higher education for them. And my understanding is at this point, 30 plus years later, things have evened out much more, although there seem to be some disparities still in that community in terms of education and work and even work opportunity. As one can imagine, this is not something that gets solved in a generation.
Were the elders studying Torah in Ethiopia, much as we see the ultra-Orthodox in Israel today?
I don't know. I can't. I have no reference
Yeah.
with that at all. Speaking of being breakthroughs, I happened to be in Israel when an alum of Emanu-El came to visit. He was the very first soldier in the IDF to receive a commission.
Yeah.
And he came over in Operation Moses as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was, again, a breakthrough, like the 2 students you referenced. That's
Yeah.
what reminded me of this young man who was very, very proud to show us his officer stripes.
'Cause remember, in Israel, the military is one of the great places where people mix and match and can see success. So when you have Ethiopians who are starting to see success in the Israeli military, that's an indicative and maybe an opening in terms of how they would do in the overall society.
Today, they're Ethiopian senior officers.
Yes.
At what point did Israel realize these caravans or trailer parks was a mistake?
Wasn't a mistake. They had to have housing for them,
Yeah.
so it served that purpose. I think, are you alluding to the fact, the mistake of trying to integrate the 2 communities?
You mean that you're talking Russian and Ethiopian?
Yeah, is that what you were alluding to?
Yeah.
Well, it became quite apparent. I was going to tell a story about the town of Yokneam, and I'll get to it a little as a prime example of Russians versus Ethiopians. Israel experienced similar problems early in its founding between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities.
Mm-hmm.
And it took years for those communities to mesh and meld and to be accepted and to have marriages that were families welcomed. With the Ethiopians and the Sabras, the Israelis, native-born Israelis, the integration was somewhat easier. And I have to say somewhat because there's still discrimination in Israel with the Ethiopian community. There was a demonstration in Tel Aviv just before the pandemic. I guess that's about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, a major demonstration in Tel Aviv, discrimination of jobs and housing, and similar to some of the problems we face here in America with lower income people. And so it hasn't been resolved yet, but there are still problems in that area. The Ethiopians have not been fully accepted yet. It's happening, it's evolving, which is important. I always look at trending. Trending is important to me. If something is heading in the right direction, some things can't be rushed successfully. You've got to let things evolve. And I'm satisfied on a personal level that things are evolving for the better with the Ethiopian community, as we pointed out, with the military, within education, and so on and so forth. So that seems to be moving along. While we discussed the religious aspect of the Ethiopians earlier, I think it's important to bring up the Falash Mura, because that is an issue among the throngs of Ethiopians that have come to Israel, are relatives of Beta Israel, the Jews, but have converted. And what do you do with them? All of a sudden, they're in Israel, they want to practice Judaism, they want to give up they converted to Christianity.
By force? Were they forced to do that?
In some cases in Ethiopia, they were forced. In other cases, because of marriage, so on and so forth, intermarriage, they did it of their own volition, but there was forced conversion.
Yeah, this has the feel of the Inquisition to it in a
Yeah,
way.
I'm not that familiar with Ethiopian history to even address that with any authority. And it's an issue today. Even those that are still in Ethiopia wanting to come to Israel, they have to make a determination as to whether they are Christian, which means they come back on a different basis. They don't come back under the law of return. Under the law of return, you have certain rights, full rights as an Israeli, voting and property ownership and other things like that. If you're not Jewish, you certainly can come to Israel. There are Muslims and Christians living throughout Israel and have rights, but they have to go through a process, which if you're Jewish, you don't. So the Israeli government, the religious authorities and the government have to make a determination as to whether they have converted. Some of them say they never converted, some say they were forced to convert, so on and so forth. So that's an issue that Israel was dealing with after Operation Solomon and is still dealing with those coming in from Ethiopia as we sit here today.
You know, Eric, at some point I'd like to talk about sort of the legends of the origins of the Ethiopian Jews before we get to Cary's experience with them.
This is a good point to do that,
Is it?
Spike. Yeah.
All right, great, because that's always what has fascinated me. There's this, beautiful idea of the Jewish people come in lots of different forms and colors and flavors and languages. When 7th and 8th century BCE, you have the fall of the two Jewish countries, Judah and Israel, and with it you have the galut, the exile of the Jewish people that are sent to, according to our terminology, the four corners of the earth. When Jews start regathering in Jerusalem 100 or so years later, you have what is known as the lost tribes remain lost. So of the 12 tribes, 10 don't come back in any significant way or form. And where do they go? That's part of the beautiful romanticized mystery of the Jewish people. So one of the legends that the Ethiopian Jews have about themselves is that they are the lost tribe of Dan. That the tribe of Dan, when they were expelled, eventually made their way down to Ethiopia and settled. Now, there's other legends that they associate with themselves as well. In Tanakh, King Solomon, who has many wives in the thousands, meets the Queen of Sheba, who comes from the land of Cush, which is modern-day Ethiopia, who comes with her whole, traveling court, and she brings many gifts. And according to the legend, they're impressed with each other and consort with each other. And when she leaves, Solomon sends her with gifts. What are the gifts? One of them is that she is pregnant with his son, an individual named Emanu-El, who goes to Ethiopia according to their legend, and then becomes a strong young man, goes back to meet Dad. Dad teaches him lots of things, okay? And there's some esoteric knowledge that's supposed to come from King Solomon, who's known as wise in many ways, to his son. And when he sends his son away, he sends his son with many gifts as well. Two things in particular. One, a retinue of Jewish scholars to take Judaism back with Emanu-El to his people back in Cush in modern-day Ethiopia. And the other, and it's unclear whether it was gifted or stolen, is the Ark of the Covenant. Mm-hmm. According to their legend, the Ark of the Covenant comes from Jerusalem back to Ethiopia, and there resides with the Jewish people for an indeterminate amount of time. Perhaps it's still there. That would be very cool. The third sort of legend that comes with them is there was and this is hard fact, that there was a Jewish garrison on the island of Elephantine down by Aswan in Egypt. And this is right around the time of Cleopatra. And they were the garrison against the forces to the south. In a series of civil wars that happened in Egypt, they're forced to move, to flee. And the legend is that these soldiers from Elephantine make their way down eventually to Ethiopia, intermarry with the local population, and that's how you have the B'nai Yisrael there. There's other sort of sprinklings of legends and theories that go around with that, and it's probably not one. It could be variations of many of these, that there are waves of Jews getting to Ethiopia and infusing that Jewish population with other forms of Judaism, but all pre-Talmudic. The last theory, which is the least interesting of them, although it might be the most true, is that in the 14th century there's a conversion, a mass conversion to Judaism from a group of Ethiopians who are probably Christian at the time, and that's how you get a Jewish community there. So as far as I can tell, nobody really knows the answer to any of these, but boy, is it interesting to see these legends come to life. And so when the Israeli government was deciding, can they and should they bring the Ethiopian Jews to Israel, which is, as far as I know, the largest group of mass migration out of Africa to somewhere else, not in chains. They came as free people, right? And that's so with all the problems that Israel has had and continues to have with the Ethiopians, let's not lose the fact that they went and rescued these people who are being tossed and turned by war and famine at the bottom of the proverbial food chain. But one of the reasons that the rabbis brought forward was that there is documentation from earlier rabbis about the Jews living in that area and that they were really Jews. And so based on some of these earlier rabbinic reports and this sort of the romanticized, hey, this is the lost tribe that we're bringing in, according to the prophecies that, hey, at some point, all of the Jews are going to be returned from the four corners of the earth back to the center as a sign along the way that sort of, what's supposed to happen in history is happening.
Yep.
And it did.
So we only have 9 more tribes to find.
Yeah.
Incidentally, the vast majority of Ethiopian Jews lived in the Gondar area, Gondar, Gondar province in northern Ethiopia, which borders the Sudan. And anybody that was interested in this topic ought to read about Operation Solomon and even Operation Moses and how the Sudanese played a role, et cetera, et cetera. But that's off topic. It's off topic for where we're going.
I would like to get into how much money in the budget was allocated for this project, and you as chairman determined you had to study what are their needs.
Okay.
What specifically are their
that's okay. I'm a member at the time of the overall Israel and Overseas Committee. The committee decides to allocate a portion of the campaign, $500,000 for direct service projects, to go to a myriad of projects, one of which was Emanu-El, putting you up to date with before. It was determined, based on Chaim Perry's visit in Atlanta to our board, that we would focus on direct service projects for Ethiopians. It was in the infinite wisdom of the chair of Israel Overseas Committee at the time, co-chairs, they decided to establish a subcommittee to focus on Ethiopia resettlement, and they tapped me to chair it. We formed a subcommittee, and we determined right away that, number one, we need somebody on the ground in Israel. So, and that person we determined would be a half-time person, a social worker, to represent us there. And number two, we'd have to determine what the needs are. And we'd need this person and Chaim Perry and other resources we had in Israel to help us determine what the needs are and then how we can address the needs here in Atlanta. We can't solve the whole problem. We immediately determined that the government is taking care of the educational process. So we weren't going to devote any of our funds to the educational process other than taking care of the small children, what we would call daycare today. The committee came up with essentially 3 major projects, and they were sub-projects, but one of them, we made a quick determination that we wanted to keep the people residing in Neve Carmel busy doing something productive. We also determined that they needed income and they needed food to eat. There happened to be a huge piece of land adjacent to Neve Carmel, right on the highway. And we got to the authorities and they allowed us to use it, fence it, and we funded basically a farm. Now they live in their trailers, but during the day they would work the farms. The produce that they would generate, they used for their own consumption, and they also had stands along the highway, and people would stop just like we have here in America and buy their produce, and it would generate some income. So that was one project, and it worked well.
And so you were giving them something they already knew how to do.
Right, and we provided the tools that they needed, not only the seeds, but the farming equipment that they needed. We didn't buy huge tractors, but barring that, we gave them whatever they needed to be successful with this endeavor was a part of what we funded. Another thing we determined, as I mentioned earlier, the people in Ethiopia lived in huts. They didn't have they didn't have kitchens. So here, all of a sudden, they're thrust into a society where the food had to be generated in a kitchen. They were cooking outside the hut over fire. So we thought cooking lessons for the women would be something very productive. And I remember going to one class, and they decided, the educators we hired to teach these women cooking, decided the easiest thing to teach them to make right away was pizza. And pizza is very popular in Israel, and it's a very easy thing, and they could relate to it because they had a certain type bread that worked, and it was tomato sauce and cheese and so on and so forth, and you put it in the oven, and you have dinner for the family. The third thing that we did is we decided to set up a summer camp for children at Emanu-El for the little ones. And we selected 8 teenagers from Atlanta that would go over and participate, one of whom happened to be my daughter, Jenna, and she was a Sefti song leader, so there she was schlepping her guitar to Israel, and she took charge of the music program for these kids, and so it was at Emanu-El, a day camp, and here these little children who spoke Amharic, starting to learn Hebrew, she was teaching them Reform music. So they were all singing all the songs that she knew, and so on and so forth. But that program worked very well, and there was an interesting side note to that. We decided to take the kids, instead of letting them sleep together at Emanu-El, we set up rooms, their dormitory rooms with 3. We put a Sabra, an Ethiopian, and one of our Atlantans in the room, so they would get to mix and get to know each other. And that was an incredible experience for our kids as well. So it was a side benefit to that program. That program worked very, very well. So that was year 1. I have to, the person in the Israeli government in charge of this whole thing is called the Minister of Absorption, and he's a cabinet member. But prior to Operation Moses, it was a minor position, actually, because immigrants were trickling into Israel, but not in mass numbers. So you had your defense, your treasury, your foreign policy, and the prime minister. Those were your senior cabinet members. But now, because of what was going on particularly with Operation Solomon, with 1 million plus and the Ethiopians, all of a sudden it was a major part of the economy, of the whole system. So Yair Tsaban, who was the Minister of Absorption, was elevated to a senior cabinet position. He happened to hear about what we were doing. And I get a call from his office from Jerusalem, could I please come to Israel and explain to him what I'm talking about now, how this whole thing came about, what the successes that we see, what the failures, because he envisioned this something that federations all over the United States could do. And so the Minister of Absorption calls you, what do? You make plane reservations. I flew to Israel with one of the professional staff from Federation, and we met our lady on the ground there, and we spent the day in his office in Jerusalem. And he was very, very impressed. As a matter of fact, I guess it was a few months later, we got another call. He wanted to come and visit us in Atlanta. which was wonderful. He wanted to thank us for what we were doing on behalf of the State of Israel officially. And just a very quick side note, it's one of the more amusing things that's ever happened to me in this regard. David Sarnat and another leader of Federation and myself decided to take him to Chops for lunch. We wanted to go to the finest. That was one of the finest of the finest.
Yes, it was.
So I'm sitting at a table, a round table like this, the four of us. He's sitting where you are, Eric, and they were known to have the best shrimp cocktail in the entire Southeast, and I love them. But sitting with an Israeli, I dare order shrimp. I wouldn't do it. And so I ordered something I chose, which was good, but something I would have preferred to have the shrimp cocktail. The waiter goes over to him, and he looks at the waiter, and he says, "Tell me, how is your escargot?" And he proceeded to order escargot. So, I didn't want to make a scene. I just ate what I ordered, so on and so forth. So I thought that was kind of an amusing side note. At any rate, the second year, what do we do the second year? At that time, we also had a tie-in to the town of Yokneam. And I had been familiar with Yokneam because of my work with the Chamber, the American Israel Chamber of Commerce. I served as chair of that group, as you know, for a couple of years. And we had a direct tie-in with not a development town, a growing high-tech center near Haifa called Yokneam.
This is the organization we now know as Connects.
Connects, yeah.
And we had connections there because Home Depot is producing PVC in that community. The company, and I'm trying to recall the name right now, that developed the pill that you swallow that takes the pictures, was headquartered there, and we had a connection with them. And Ricante Wines was up there, had an office there, and we had some connections with that, so on and so forth. Well, it so happens, just again, happenstance that happens in life, the mayor of Yokneam, his name is Simon Alfasi, was a very close personal friend of Dr. Chaim Perry, and he was Iraqi, if I recall correctly, and he had an interest in the Ethiopian community, and he said to Chaim Perry, "Look, why don't we bring some Ethiopians to live in our community?" And they were building condos at the time. And these condos had buildings that had about 8 units each, but it was a whole development of condos. And their plan was to put 2 Ethiopian families, give them the condos, finance it, give it to them. That was, again, Federation didn't buy them condos. We couldn't afford that, but the government handled it. And they were putting them in with Russians. And some Sabras were moving into it. It was a growing town. It was a great opportunity there. And so the committee decided that we would focus, the best thing we could do in trying to integrate the communities. I remember the brainstorming session we had about this, and we were all excited. If we could get the children to play together, get used to one another, then the families might be able to connect. So we decided to build a playground, fund the building of a playground as part of this development. And not only would we do that, but we'd have a memorial to the fallen who died on the way to Israel. And there were thousands that died in the Sudan. And then we also decided to run a mission to Israel, Federation mission to Israel. And I brought 175 people to Israel, 5 buses, for the dedication of the playground and the memorial. It was a great idea. Well, I have to tell you, the idea didn't work. The Ethiopian kids loved it. The little bitty children, they loved it. The Sabras used the playground too, and it worked to a certain degree. The Russians absolutely wouldn't go near any place that the Ethiopian children were. While we were there with this dedication, they had a demonstration in the town square in Yokneam about the integrating of Ethiopians into the condos. Against, of course, and it was totally Russian.
Interesting.
So that about concluded my direct serving the community. Oh, the mayor of Yokneam asked me the next time I was in Israel to visit with him, and I was surprised, during which he presented to me the keys to the city for my work on behalf of Ethiopian Jewry. And there was a, kind of a ceremony. It was a surprise, and it was a very, very nice thing to do.
And it would have been wonderful if the kids got to know each other, because the new generations would accept each other. But the adults in the Russian community absolutely prohibited participation.
They were bigoted people.
How big a problem is that today in Israel? Do you have any idea?
There is still an integration problem in Israel. I don't know that it's being led by the Russians. Don't forget, by this time, you're talking about them coming over in the early 1990s. You're dealing with children of Russians. They're different. They're becoming Sabras. Their mindset is Israeli. So I don't think, and this is speculation on my part, with the older generation, I would bet that there are issues. I bet an older Russian parent, God forbid their child wanted to marry an Ethiopian, they probably would go bonkers. That's an assumption on my part. With the young people, that's what I said, why I said earlier, evolving, trending.
Yeah.
And
Can't force this.
yeah, it's we witnessed it happening again with the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic, and the Mizrahi communities coming together. Today, there's no difference. None whatsoever. There's blending of families culturally and socially and every other aspect of Israeli life. My hope and dream is that in the not too distant future, it would be exactly the same with the Ethiopians. There's no reason it shouldn't happen except some latent bigotry, and I feel it's with the older generation and less with the younger. You know, with the younger generation too, you have to understand they all serve in the younger generation serve in the military together.
Right.
They get to know each other as peers.
And I've seen evidence of that. I'm on the board of the regional chapter of Friends of the IDF here.
Yeah.
And they bring soldiers into town to meet us, and a number of them have been Ethiopian, and the camaraderie between the soldiers is really, it gives you chills. And they love that connection. Cary, as you mentioned, this integration, this assimilation of cultures cannot be forced. It's got to evolve. And I would think that the idea was that get the children together, much as happens in the United States today, and they don't see a difference between themselves, and they grow up accepting each other.
Well, that has certainly happened, and I think a major change, of course, is due to the service in the IDF, where all cultures serve together. And if you've been in the military, you know that that all differences disappear. And it happens that way. It really does. It happened with me in the military. So in Israel, when you have Ethiopians serving with Sabras and those with Russian heritage and so on and so forth, it's going to disappear, and those people will go on in life, and they'll work together in industry. They'll marry. There'll be blended families, so on and so forth. So I feel pretty optimistic over the long term, or the medium term, I really should say, that any discrimination or any differences with the Ethiopians will disappear. One thing I think it's important to note also, the current Minister of Absorption is an Ethiopian woman. Major breakthrough. And she's doing a superb job. She's in the middle of this issue with bringing the remaining 11,400 over, and she's very well respected, and it's great to see.
I have some personal experience with an Ethiopian family when Marita and I were over in Israel for my first year at seminary at Hebrew Union College. One of the things that we were asked to do was a weekly service project, and a number of us asked to be assigned to the absorption center, which is right outside of Jerusalem, where we were essentially paired up with a family. So I, on a weekly basis for a year, went over and spent time with one particular Ethiopian family. The mom's name was Waga. She had 6 children. The 2 oldest had been sent to a religious boarding school. The teenagers were sort of running around, and I'd see them sometimes, 8 children. The two younger boys were the ones that I spent the most time with, and they were about 7 and 8. And then there was two twin little girls who were about 2 years old. The father never made it over, and I could never quite get the story right. Wasn't sure if he was alive. I don't know if she knew if he was alive, but he had never made it over. So here's Wago, who's got essentially 6 kids in the home to take care of, and it was a two-bedroom apartment. The two older ones had been launched as well as she could. And at first, everybody was very hesitant. I was out of my element, and so were they. Their Hebrew was limited, and so was mine at that point. But we managed by, hand gestures and, a lot of soccer with the kids. And before long, the way that the Ethiopians would welcome somebody into their home is with food. That was the way that you did it. You'd come in and they feed you. And the food that they would give me every week when I came, and oftentimes I really was not hungry, like I was fine, but they would insist that I eat, was the bread that Cary was talking about, sort of a long flat bread, and a potato dish. And the humor came when they like very spicy foods. And I'm a New England guy, like salt is as spicy as we get in my house. And I would take a bite of this potato and I would just start sweating, like profusely sweating. And they would laugh and laugh and laugh. And that was our thing that we do every week. I would entertain them by my sweating. They would laugh, and eventually she started making it less spicy so it wouldn't hurt me, but it was still very, very spicy.
Did they offer you buna, the coffee?
Yes, we had the coffee a couple times. I know it was called buna, yes. And the coffee, I would take a sip, and that was
like mud.
Yeah, it was
Like,
enough. It was very thick. It was enough for me. The two little girls, I thought their names were Asur and Lo, because that's what the mother was always saying to them. Asur means forbidden, and Lo means no. And she'd always say Asur, Lo, Asur. I thought that's what the kids' names were. And I spent most of my time with the youngest boys, playing soccer and really getting to know them, and I cared very deeply for them. I'll tell you one particular story. So Marita and I, when we got there, she was going from our place to Hebrew U that year and learning Arabic, amongst other things. That was also a year in Israel that lots of bombs were going off in our neighborhood in Jerusalem, and I was not crazy about her taking public buses. So we bought a car, and at the end of the year we sold the car. And so I would take this car sometimes to the absorption center and meet with the family. And we happened to splurge and buy a convertible, and it wasn't a fancy convertible. It was a French Peugeot, like the type of car you might get for your 17-year-old daughter type thing. But that was the car that we got there, and the kids loved it when I pulled up with the top down. They thought it was the most amazing thing. I would give the kids rides around the circle, and not just my two. The kids would line up in the neighborhood to get the rides around the absorption center. So they were always asking me if they could go to sort of the Israeli version of McDonald's. And I would say, yeah, at some point we'll do it. And finally one day I said, sure, let's go. Got permission from the mom. They hopped in the back of the car. Oh, and the only time that they had ever been in the car, these two little boys, was when they had come from the airport to the absorption center, right? So it wasn't just the convertible that was the novelty, it was the car and being able to be in the car. I'd show them how do you open the door from the inside the car, and unlock and that type of thing. So we go to the McDonald's. It wasn't McDonald's.
It was McDavid's.
McDavid's or something like that.
Yeah,
I forget.
McDee's.
I don't remember what it was.
It was McDee's.
It was the cheap hamburger place that people would go
business,
to.
Yeah.
Because it was awful. That's why I went out of business. So they're looking at the menu, and they say, in Hebrew, what can we get? I said, whatever you want, like literally whatever you want. And they're looking, and they're like, I'll take a hamburger. Each of them said that. So they got the most simple version of the hamburger. And we sit down, and they're all ready to go. They're so excited. First time ever having one of these, and as far as I know, eating outside of their community. And with all the gusto you can imagine, they take a bite out of this hamburger, spit it out. It was disgusting for them. So in the same way that their food, I just couldn't deal with it. What we think is sort of the basis of the hamburger of Western food, or at least little kids, and they took a bite, and it was disgusting for them. The texture is what they said. The texture is disgusting for them. So there were differences, but I can tell you that there was real love, and I wasn't the only one who spent time in sort of a big brother, big sister type program, and there was real love and connection. And my regret is the internet was around, but barely around as we were doing this, and I lost track of them. And then a couple years later, I went back and I managed to find Waga, because they had moved out of the apartment. They were moved around quite a bit. I found her. The boys were at the same boarding school as the older brothers by that point, so I couldn't see them. The two little girls, Asur and Lo, Forbidden and No, they were older, so we had a conversation. Everybody was glad to see each other, but that was sort of the end of it. But she was industrious, I can tell you that, and there was, when we talk about the apartment, there was no luxury. It was bare basics, but they seemed very happy.
Well, compared to a hut, it probably was a big improvement. We're running low on time, and I wanted you to describe a very moving moment you witnessed at the Western Wall with the Ethiopians, because it's a beautiful story.
It was a Temple Emanu-El trip to Israel, and I was co-leading it with Rabbi Colbert. And again, you talk about timing and happenstance in life. We were taking the group up to the room that was purported to be the Last Supper, and I had been in that room many times. So Scott took the group up the steps, and I had, like I always did, my two cameras hanging from my camera jacket. I saw a little bird pecking away at something, and it was just very interesting. I picked up my camera, and I was so absorbed in taking photographs of this bird that I looked at my watch, and they didn't come down. So I go up the room, and it's empty. Apparently, there was steps down the back.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. And they were they were headed to the Christian quarter to look at the Villa de Rosa and, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that's part of the tour Scott was taking them. But we were all to converge at the wall. I knew that. So I headed directly over to the plaza in front of the wall, and it's always magical to be there. And all of a sudden, I hear singing coming in from the gate, and a whole throng of Ethiopian young men wearing white, all dressed in white, lockstep in arm, about 5 abreast, marching and singing with their Kasim walking in front of them in his native garb, carrying his Torah, which was in a wooden type
Sephardi
holder.
style.
Yeah.
Stands up, and you read it standing up.
And march past me, of course, and I'm almost in the middle of them shooting all these pictures.
Blending.
Yeah, and they went into I was outside the wall area. I was in the plaza, and they went into the wall area, and they were there for their bar mitzvah.
Oh.
It was a bar mitzvah of 100 Ethiopian boys.
Wow.
It was very and I followed them in, and I did take pictures. But nobody said I couldn't, and they were reading Torah, and and it was just very, very emotional and a very unique situation to find myself in.
How are the pictures?
The pictures came out great.
You have a prayer for the exiled, which I didn't realize until you told us about that. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, so this is part of the traditional Amidah, which is said on a weekday, when you say the Amidah on your weekday prayer. And the Amidah is a series of prayers, all sort of leading up to the eventual, hey, this is the way that things are supposed to be, that we're praying for. You're praying for health and healing and a year of prosperity. And you've got the traditional prayer for the ingathering of those exiles that were sent off to the 4 corners of the earth, and recently have started to come back to the land. So it goes, I'll do it in Hebrew than English. Tiker b'shafer gadol l'teirutenu. Sound the great shofar for our freedom. V'sa nes l'kabetz giliotenu. Raise the banner to gather our exiles and gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth. V'kabsenu yachad b'me'er kanfav ha'aretz. Baruch atah Adonai mekabetz nidchei amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gathers in the dispersed of his people. Israel.
Wow. The point of these videos that we do for the temple is to capture the experiences of members who have intersected with history. And you, through 17 visits to Israel, have connected in a big way with some of the biggest history in the movement of these Ethiopians to Israel. It's a wonderful process. Thank you very much for your story.
Well, thank you for saying so. It's been more rewarding to me. It's just been one of the highlights of my life, focusing on that community within the scope of the work that I did for Israel.
Spike, thank you.
And Eric, thank you for being the convener of conversation.